Hi all, I welcome you to this session on Angular, and today we are going to learn all there is to know about Angular forms. Before we begin, let's look at our agenda for today. So first of all, I'm going to start with talking a little bit about Angular forms, a little introduction to Angular forms. Then we are going to do a head-to-head comparison between reactive forms versus template-driven forms, followed by which we are going to look at each of these types of forms separately and in more detail. With that, I come to the end of this agenda. So without much ado, let's get started. So Angular Forms assist you in managing the user input. It accepts the input and sends it to the server for processing. And as we all know, the majority of web applications depend on forms to serve various purposes, such as retrieving search results, entering emails, submitting blank details, signing in using usernames, passwords, etc. Angular basically provides two types of forms, namely reactive and template-driven forms. However, the building blocks of these forms are common. First of all, you have your form control, which is used to keep track of the values and the validation of each form control, followed by form group, which is used to track the same values along with the status for a collection of form controls. Then you have something known as a form array. Now, this feature is used to keep track of the same values as mentioned before, along with the status for an array of form controls. And finally, we have control value assessor, which is used to create a link between the form control instances and the original DOM elements. Now, if we did a head-to-head comparison between reactive forms and template-driven forms, we would notice certain differences between them. Setup. Now, in reactive forms, the component class directly defines the form model, whereas in template-driven forms, the ngModel directive is liable to generate the form control instances. Reactive forms, which are built within the component class, are more explicit, whereas template-driven forms are less explicit. Then we have something known as a data flow. Now, form elements in reactive forms are associated directly to a form control instance, whereas in template-driven forms, each element of the form is linked to a directive, and this directive will manage the form model internally. Next, let's look at validation. Now, reactive forms define specific validators as functions. These functions receive the control to validate. Template-driven forms are linked to the template directives and must specify the custom validator directives that wrap up the functions for validation. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about testing. Now, testing is easier when it comes to reactive forms as there is synchronous access to the forms and the data model. Therefore, reactive forms can be tested without having to render the user interface. On the other hand, template-driven forms make testing slightly complicated as they require a sound knowledge of how the directives are executing for every cycle, as well as the change detection process. Then let's talk a little bit about mutability. The data in a reactive form is pure, therefore the forms are immutable. So in case there is a change that is triggered, a new data model is triggered by form control. In template-driven forms, on the contrary, there is mutability. They are mutable. They make use of Angular's two-way data binding in order to update the data model where there are changes made to the templates. And finally, scalability. Angular's reactive forms not just provide synchronous access to the form model, but they also provide low-level APIs which help in easily creating large-scale forms. Template-driven forms focus mainly on simple scenarios. Now that we have a clear distinction of both the kinds of forms, let's go ahead and look at each of them in some depth. So first of all, we have reactive forms. Now, Angular's reactive forms can be used to create forms whose values change with time. They provide a model-driven approach to handle the state of Angular forms at some given time. As mentioned earlier, when changes are initiated, they give rise to a new state, thereby taking care of the integrity of the form model. Reactive forms cater to a direct path for testing purposes as the data is predictable and consistent. So let's move ahead and create them. I have already created an Angular project here. In case you have any doubts regarding how to install Angular and create an Angular project, you can refer to the Angular 8 tutorial, the link to which I will leave in the description box below. So the first step is to import Reactive Forms module. This module is present within the @Angular/forms package. So I will open this file, which is the app.module.ts file, and import it. Next, I will have to add it with the imports array as well. Next, what you're going to do is create a new component using the command ng-generate component RFS. Now, RFS is the name of the component. It can be anything. So you can basically give any name of your choice. Remember that whenever you create a new component, you will have to import its class within the app.module.ts file. So you're going to go ahead and open the app.module.ts file. Now, as you can see on the screen, the component has been added in my app.component.ts file, and this is because I have added the auto import extension. If you do not have this extension, you will have to manually import it. Now, the most basic building block in the case of Reactive Forms is the form control class. So you will have to import the form control class within the rfs.component.ts file, and then you're going to create a new instance, that is the employee name of the form control, which you are then going to use as class property in the templates. Here, we have set the initial value of the employee name as an empty string using the form control constructor. All the controls that you create in your component class will help you in various tasks, such as getting instant access to listen for, updating, checking the form validation, etc. Moving on, we have step 3, which is updating the template. Once you create controls within the component class, you will have to link it to a form control element within the template of the component. Next, you'll use property binding to bind the form control provided by form control directive to the name value. Okay, so now the form control is registered to the employee name input element present within the template of this component. Here, the form control and the DOM element will communicate to reflect changes made in the views and the templates. The final step is to display this component. To do this, you will add the selector of the RFS component within the app.component.html file. Next, we're going to open the styles.css file of this application and then add a bootstrap link to add some cascading style sheets to this application. Finally, you're going to save and run the application using this ngserve command. As you can see, the form control that you assign to the employee name property is displayed on the screen. Next, let's go ahead and discuss something known as a control value management. Now, at any point in time, Angular Reactive Forms give the user access to both the form control state and the value. To change the current state or the values, you can use the component class and the template. Let me show you an example of how to display the value of the form control instance and also change it. The first thing to do is to display the form control value. You can do this in two ways. One, either through the value changes observable, where you can listen for the changes in the form's value in the template using async pipe, or in the component class using the subscribe method. And the second way is with the value property, which gives you a snapshot of the current value. In the following example, I'll show you how to display the current value using interpolation in the template. So when you modify the form control element, this displayed value will change accordingly. Angular's reactive forms give you access to the details about some control through the properties and methods provided with the instances. These properties and methods of the underlying abstract control class are used to control form state and determine when to display messages when handling validation. Now, how can you replace a form control value? So the values can be changed without the user interaction. A form control instance provides a set value method that updates the value of the form control and validates the structure of the value provided against the control structure. For example, when retrieving form data from a backend API or service, you can use the set value method to update the control to its new value, which replaces the old value entirely. We are going to add a method to the component class that will update the value to John using the set value method. We are also going to include a button that will update the name. Now let's get back to the development server. As you can see, when I click on the refresh button, the value of the employee name gets updated as John. Now the next thing is how to group form controls. A single form control instance, as we have seen in the previous example, gives us control over a single input field. Similarly, a form group instance checks the form state for a group of form control instances. When the form group is created, every control present in a form group instance is traced by the name. In the next example, we will see how to manage multiple form control instances in a single group. What we're going to do is we will import the form group and form control classes present in the @angular/forms package. So the first thing we're going to do here is to create a form group instance. Now let's create a property called the employee form and set this to a new form group instance. To initialize the form group, you're going to have to provide the constructor with an object of the named keys mapped to their control. For the employee form, we're going to add two form control instances, namely the name and the designation. The individual form controls, that is the name and the designations, are now grouped together. The form group instance provides its model value as an object reduced from the values of each control in the group. This group instance has the same properties and methods as those of form control instances. The next step is to link the form group model with the view or the template. Now for every control, the form group will track the status and then modify. In case even one of the controls is changed, the parent control also generates a new status or value change. The model for the group is maintained from its members. Now, after you define the model, you must update the template to reflect the model in the view. I will copy paste the code that I already have. Here the employee form group is linked to the form element with the form group directive. This creates a communication zone between the model and the form that consists of the inputs. The input form control name, which is provided by the form control name directive, binds each individual input to the form control defined as form group. The form controls that we have created here will communicate with their corresponding elements. And not just that, they also communicate changes to the form group instance, which provides the source of truth for the model value. So the next thing is to save the form data. So how are you going to do that? The RFs component accepts input from the user. But in a real scenario, you will want to capture the form value and make it available for further processing outside the component. The form group directive listens to the submit event emitted by the form element and emits an ng-submit event that you can bind to a callback action. Now all you have to do is add an ng-submit event listener to the form tag with the onSubmit callback method. The onSubmit method in the RF's component captures the current value of the employee form. Now let's make use of this button element and create a submit button. Let us get back to our development server and see how the form we just created looks. Now this is how your form looks. Similarly, you can also create nested form groups. To do that, you're going to add the employee address with the employee form. So let's get back to the rfs.component.ts file and add some nested fields. Now the address will have two subparts, namely the country and the city. I will copy paste the code that I already have. So what we're going to do is create new form control instances for them that will be nested within the address form group. Finally, you're going to add these fields within the views. So the name and the designation becomes one heading and the address will be the other. Now let's get back to the development server and see how it looks. So this is how it looks. So by now you must have understood how to create reactive forms in Angular. In this tutorial, we will not be focusing on form validation. So let's move on and see how to create template-driven forms in Angular. Now in the previous section, we created an employee form using reactive forms. Now what we're going to do is create a separate template-driven employee form. To do that, first we are going to create the employee model class, followed by creating the component that controls the form. The third step deals with creating a template that specifies the form layout, and the next step is to bind data properties to each form control using the ng model two-way data binding syntax. Finally, we are going to add a name attribute to each form input control. So first of all, let's go ahead and create the employee model class. This model class will specify the layout of the form. You can also call it a property bag that holds facts about a thing of application importance. That describes well the employee class with its fields such as ID, name, designation, and an optional field such as skills. So within the command prompt, type the command ng-generate class emp to generate a new class named emp. I will copy paste the code that I already have. Now it is the job of the TypeScript compiler to generate a public field for all the public constructor parameters. Not just that, the compiler will also auto-assign the value of the parameter to that field when you create employees. Now an employee can be created by creating an instance of the EMP type and passing the designated values to each of the fields such as ID, name, designation, and the skill. So the next thing you're going to do is to create a new component for the template-driven form. Now in Angular forms, there are basically two parts. That is the template, which is based on HTML, and a component class, which handles the data and user interactions technically. We are going to begin with the class as it briefly describes what the employee editor can do. So within the command prompt, type the following command. Then what you're going to do is within the component class, create a list of skills such as Java, Python, SQL, and C++, and then create a new property known as model that will hold all these EMP fields or EMP fields. So I will just specify the ID as 101, name as John, designation as project manager, and set the initial skill to the skill present at an index number 0, which is Java. This component is just like any other component you create in an Angular project. There's nothing that is specific to the form. So simply put, the import statements import the Angular core library and the EMP model that we just created. The selector present within the app component decorator specifies the value of app-tdf, using which you can add the form in the parent template using the same tag. The template HTML is pointed out by template URL, and finally you have your employee data within the component class. So next what we are going to do is we are going to modify the root module. Here the app.module.ts specifies the application's root module. You can add external modules that you will need to use in your applications and declare all the components that are a part of this module. Therefore, you will need to add the TDF component within the app.component.ts file. Next, you will have to add the forms module within the app.modules file because template-driven forms are in their own module. Therefore, I'm going to import forms module and also specify it within the imports array. Now our application has access to all the template-driven forms features, including the ng model. Also, if you have noticed, the TDS class has been imported automatically because of the auto import extension. If you do not have this extension, make sure you manually import the component class as well as add it within the imports array. Moving on, next, you're going to display the template-driven form. Now to display the content of the template-driven form, you're going to have to remove the reactive form tag from the app.component.html and replace it with the app-tdf tag. So next, we are going to be creating the HTML form template. I will copy paste the code that I already have. And this is what it looks like. So here we have specified the name, designation, and the skills. Please note that for skills, I have made use of the ng-for directive. In case you do not know about this structural directive, you can refer to our Angular directives video, the link to which again I shall leave in the description box below. Now we're going to save everything and run the application using ngserve. So what do you see now? You probably see the form but no data. And this is because we have not performed any two-way data binding yet. So let's go ahead and do that. Now for this, I'm going to be using the ng model syntax, which makes it easy to bind the form to the model. Now let's go ahead and run the application. As you can see, the data of the employee has been retrieved. And if I make changes to any of these details, you will see that the corresponding value within the diagnostic output also changes. Now this is because of the two-way data binding. Let me just go ahead and show this to you all. As you can see, the name appears to be Joe. So when I make changes to John, you can see that the name is being altered within the diagnostic as well. This brings us to the end of our session. I hope you have enjoyed and learned something new. Thank you and have a great day.